This is the Wisdom Podcast.
Welcome to the Wisdom Podcast. I'm Daniel Aitken, and in today's episode, I'm interviewing Professor Robert Thurman, renowned scholar of Buddhism and friend of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. In this conversation, we talk about Professor Thurman's journey from Buddhist monk to Buddhist professor. We talk about Buddhism and science, meditation and hallucinogenics, the protector controversy, and much, much more. We hope you enjoy this episode. You went on a search to Asia, and I'm interested in what you were looking for and what you found.
Yeah. Well, I had dropped out of my senior year at Harvard undergraduate, and I was looking for better courses in philosophy and psychology. And I had the sense that India had those better courses. And unusually for some of our colleagues in Tibetan studies, I wasn't in search of Shangri-La or Tibet, actually. I was not necessarily thinking that Dalai Lama was everything. He was only vaguely on my radar. And it was not Tibetomania. It was something about India. And maybe I would say I was looking for a yoga of the emotions, actually. I was interested in physical yoga. I was interested in Buddhism. I was interested in psychology and philosophy, especially. I was reading Wittgenstein pretty avidly, the later and earlier Wittgenstein, especially the later one. And I read a lot of psychology up to Wilhelm Reich and people like that. And so I thought India had answers for me. And I had a friend who was a motorcycle guy. I used to ride a motorcycle, had motorcycles myself. And so I headed for India. It was like my journey to the East, Hermann Hesse was in my mind a little bit, Nietzsche, these kind of people. And on the way, I spent about a year, actually, traveling in Europe and the Middle East. And I met Sufis and Christian monks and Hindus eventually when I got to India. And but then I was a little disappointed in India by the sort of Swami Hindu trip, because I didn't feel they had the yoga and of the emotions and the logic of it. And it was more like religious thing. And I wasn't actually religious, even though I had been to monasteries and Sufi tekas and places like that on the way. And then I met the Tibetans. And the minute I met them, then something happened. But in a way, I mentioned that about India because the Tibetans were, for me, the custodians of Indian Buddhism from the very beginning. And the Indians had forgotten it and didn't know what it was. And but also, of course, the Tibetan language. In a way, I made my way back into Sanskrit through the Tibetan language because it's derived, as you know, from its grammar from Sanskrit. Tibetan grammar is. And I learned to speak Tibetan very quickly and so on. Then I had a job at the Young Lama's school in Dalhousie, and I was going to stay. I was never going to go back to the U.S., and because I had been used to being a kind of fakir along the road, and people had taken care of me quite kindly in the Middle East because they didn't have hippies at that time, 1962. There was Gary Snyder and Al Ginsberg had been in India, but nobody had really been wandering around like a penniless person like me, as I was. I wore an eye patch at the time, too, because I had lost my eye, which was one of the stimulating reasons I went looking for these deeper things, I think. So then but my father died in New York City, and my mother somehow found me through some Pakistani UN diplomat, because he had worked at the UN, and as a translator in his post-retirement second job. And so I did go back for the funeral, and then when I was back from the funeral, I met Geshe Wangyal in New Jersey by accident, and didn't go back right away to India to take my job at the Young Lama School. And instead, I really was introduced to Buddhism by Geshe Wangyal, like my root Kalyana Mitra, my Gewe Shenyen. And it was just wonderful. I had a wonderful time for a year and a half or a year and 3/4 with him. And but then he and I had a disagreement slightly in that I wanted to be a monk, and he didn't want to make me a monk, and he told me I shouldn't be one. He said he was very supportive of my study, but he said that the monk thing wouldn't work out in the long run, and I wouldn't believe that, and I kept bugging. So then toward the end of 1964, he took me back to India, ostensibly to introduce me to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who he was working for directly, in that he had some young lamas in New Jersey who I was teaching English to, and had been teaching English to. And he was reporting on that, and he was also helping some old Mongolian monks who were refugees in India having a hard time. And then he left me with Dalai Lama, and Dalai Lama took me under his wing and made me wait 8 months to be a monk because he hadn't ordained anyone before, and Geshe Wangyal had warned him not to make me a monk. But then Geshe Wangyal, being just a little Mongolian Geshe in the Tibetan hierarchy, he said, well, I'm just a little Geshe, Mongolian Geshe, and you're the Dalai Lama, you decide. Although Dalai Lama was only 29 years old at the time. And so then neither the young Dalai Lama nor the young me listened, ultimately, and he did ordain me. He had Lingam Rinpoche, and he ordained me as a Gelong, Getsul and Gelong, respectively. And I did my best to be a monk, and then I was memorizing books. I was going to do Geshe studies. And here Geshe Wangyal was a little bit mischievous, I would say, in that he came in the middle of one late-night memorization session I was having, where I was memorizing the Pramanavartika.
Oh, yeah.
And he said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm memorizing the Pramanavartika, Tsemanamda, in Tibetan. Well, why are you doing that? I said, well, I want to pass my Geshe exam, so I need to memorize these potinga, Mm-hmm. And then he looked at me and he said, do you know anybody who wants a white Geshe?
Wow.
He said that. I know exact words. And then well, what do you mean I want one? That's like thing I was saying. But that kind of aided me a little bit in that who wants one,
Yep.
But I was not sophisticated enough, I guess, or experienced enough to really know what he was meaning. But it maybe calmed my jets a little bit about that. Then later on that year, that was 66 or 65, the civil rights movement was in full swing. And my peers from Harvard and Phillips Exeter, where I'd gone to prep school, they were all involved in Vietnam War protests and involved in the civil rights movement in the South. And so I would visit in New York these young friends of mine, and I had the little taste. I had seen the Vietnamese monk burn himself, and I had a little taste of like monk activism or something like that. So I would come and go a little bit. And then at one point, Geshe Wangyal again said, you can't do that. You have to stay here and do your studies and have your novices. I was teaching some young Mongolian kids in the Kalmyk community there. And but you can't just go and run around and be an activist as a Buddhist monk. Because Geshe Wangyal was quite conservative in regard to his American hosts, although by then he was an American citizen. And so then at a certain point, I decided I would go help my friends, and I'd be like a loose monk. I was still not deciding to resign being a monk. I was just going to be a monk on his own around the city.
And you were still wearing robes.
And I was still wearing robes, and I still considered myself a monk, and I tried to do gongche in the evening. I was pretty strict, actually. I was too strict. And I was sent then by the Tibet office to South America also to be with Chonla Rinpoche, to be his interpreter. I do speak Spanish. When it comes back to me, I was fluent in Spanish before, and Tibetan to Spanish. And it was a little bit disillusioning there because here I was with this Lama who was wearing a suit, or wanted to wear a suit, and often did, and considered himself a layman. And I guess he was a layman by then. And I was wearing robes as his interpreter, like a white interpreter wearing robes with this Lama who looked like a Japanese camera salesman. And I was bugging him all the time to wear robes, and he was not wanting to, so it was stressful. Anyway, I eventually decided at some point that actually I was a monk without a country. Do you know what I mean? I had realized by then I'd been living in India with the Tibetans as a monk or proto-monk and then monk. And I realized that while they liked that I liked Buddhism and was a monk, there was no place for me in any Tibetan monastery really at that time. And they would have a second thought about me. I could kind of read minds, which was that he's an American. Where's his Jeep? Where's his money? Or where's his gun, to help us get rid of the Chinese? Do you know what I mean? Why isn't he like with the U.S. government or something helping us, or wealthy and helping us, or Jindak,
Yeah.
And I realized that somehow, if Geshe Wangyal's wisdom was true, that if I was going to be a monk for life, and my former life dictated that, why wasn't I reborn as a Tibetan? And then second, in America, we didn't even have Hare Krishnas on the street in those days, and so I was like this weirdo in a dress. Running around with a shaved head, and people didn't get it. And also, I felt by then I already had something to teach my compatriot Americans, either the guys in the psychedelic movement or the people in the civil rights and war protest movements. But then they thought of me as just some weird crazy because I wasn't like in their American thing, and Protestant Americans don't understand why anybody would want to be a monk. So then I decided to give back my robes to. And I tried to give them back to Geshe Wangyal. He wouldn't accept them. And he said, mail them to India. I didn't ordain you, and I never said you should be a monk. Mail them to the Dalai Lama. So I think I didn't have mailing money, and somehow I never did. I wrote him, but never had an answer. And I got the vibe that both Ling Rinpoche and he were highly disappointed. And I was kind of scared about that. But then I tried to just be a regular person, and then I did fall in love fairly soon with several women approached me actually who I was not in love with, and I pretended to still be a monk even though I had resigned. But then I did fall in love with Nena, and so then I tried to do jobs. She was tired of being a monk. We wanted to have children together, and so then I realized the obvious thing was to go back to school and get a PhD, and then I could still do my love of Buddhist studies and yet have a livelihood. That was the plan. So it was one thing that was good was I was able to go back as a senior because I had dropped out on a leave of absence. And so I didn't have to apply to graduate school as a sort of ex-monk.
Yes.
After 6 years of being a monk on and off, or a seeker or something like that. And so I just went back as a senior, got all straight A's, did languages, finished my English major, and then got a grant and went straight into the graduate school. And then I've never looked back. And I've had the privilege of studying and teaching Buddha Dharma and teaching in the academic setting where, of course, you're teaching in a different way than you are in a Dharma center, and continuing my Buddhist studies and actually connecting it with a livelihood thing and have been able to help a lot of other young people. There was a time when some people urged me, they said, like, why are you going back to Harvard? The Black Panthers are going to come and take Harvard apart brick by brick. This was like late 60s. And said, it's a useless profession. You can just be a Dharma teacher. What's the problem, And but I kind of had already a kind of idea about Dharma centers. And it was before either Tartang Tulku or Trungpa Tulku had made big cults in a way in America. And Geshe Wangyal was very against making a cult himself. He was a very responsible teacher. He would only teach people as long as they needed, and then he would push them about their livelihood. And just like me, he didn't want me to be a monk and then work for him in his monastery or work in India in some monastery. He wanted me to have a life, and have a livelihood. And that's why he advised me against being a monk. And so I could be more independent as a professor, And in a way, you don't teach students to be Dharma practitioners or something, but you teach them the philosophy, and then they can decide themselves what they do. But you don't proselytize in an academic thing, which is actually a good control.
Yes.
And it prevents a professor from becoming a kind of cult,
Yeah.
And it helps also the students in that they keep their academic thing and they keep a livelihood. I can't tell you how many students I helped not drop out during my career as a professor by saying, well, if you want to cultivate a Dharma side or some kind of spiritual side, that's good. But also you should work on your livelihood, because I had learned my lesson kind of. So I helped a lot over the years doing that. So that was so that's the path I took, a sort of middle way between being a professor, just a regular professor of engineering or mathematics. Actually, in my youth, as a student, I was actually particularly good at mathematics. I never made an error in a math test ever. It was like a point of pride. I always got 110%. And but I hated it. I wanted to be a writer and a poet, and I was like, who needs that? But I didn't go there. I decided I wanted to do Buddhist studies and Buddhist languages because I still did love Buddhism 100% once I discovered it.
So your journey from Buddhist monk to Buddhist professor was more about your way of integrating into the West rather than you thinking that was a better way of bringing Buddhism to the West? That's
true. And it was just to integrate my own life so I could continue my study because I just felt there was no support for a monk. And then, of course, once I fell in love with someone like soulmate sort of thing, then I was lucky I wasn't a monk. And again, Geshe Wangyal, actually, at one point I left a place I had been living, and he made me go back there where I didn't intend to go back. And that's when I did meet Nena, actually. So actually, he was very amazing. He was like, I think he was definitely clairvoyant. He had extraordinary abilities, Geshe Wangyal. There's no question about it. In my mind.
Are there some particular times, like, can you tell us a story of when you might have got the impression that you felt that he was clairvoyant?
Oh, many times. Well, for example, he had a radar about me when I would try to meditate. And whenever I would, because of course you study and you want to meditate. Even, I was living in a monastery with him, this little tiny, like monastery, unofficial monastery. And whenever I would reach a certain point in my meditations, and in my early meditations, I think, this point would be where I would start to feel like I was going into the dhyana planes and I was leaving the body. My consciousness was actually, the body was I was dropping out from the normal way of inhabiting the body and going into sort of planes. Whenever I would get close to that, he would show up at 4 in the morning, 3 in the morning. I would be out in the woods behind the monastery somewhere because, again, I was trying to evade this radar of his. So he had a clairvoyance about my state of mind, for example. Definitely proved that to me.
And just
because he would interrupt me. And I was very frustrated. And he just said, oh, you don't need that. You don't need that. Not now. Later you can do that. He would constantly do that. And only years later I realized that had I broken it through in some of those planes, I might have become very quietistic and uninterested in some kind of deeper studies that he wanted me to do first. And I think that is a procedural thing. There's a concept in Mahayana Buddhism, it's even in the Vimalakirti Sutra, which talks about how a bodhisattva does not, and I'm not saying I was a bodhisattva then, I think I was very naive and very escapist and neurotic, but it's saying the bodhisattva doesn't attain the cessation of sensation and conception at the wrong time. There's a concept like that. And he definitely showed he had such a clairvoyance. Then he also, things he's predicted to me over the years, which could be just considered wisdom and stuff, but he predicted things were absolutely right on. Like 30 years later or whatever, And some things of his that he predicted that I should do that I didn't, I do regret, as he predicted, etc. So he was an amazing person, no doubt.
And just for our listeners, because we have a broad... Just for our listeners, the very broad list, we have Theravada monks. And so in terms of the Tibetan tradition, do you want to tell us a little bit about, how the advice with regard to jhanas and instead moving to insight meditation?
I think in general, it's not only the Tibetan tradition. I think in all the traditions, there is the idea that even in Zen, which is named after dhyana, which means to meditate, the sixth patriarch said, Chan is about wisdom, not meditation. And there are many Zen stories about people who they can't get there by meditating, but they need wisdom. Then they do meditate to get the wisdom, but they need the wisdom. Then every kind of Buddhism has the idea of 3 levels of wisdom. Wisdom born of learning, wisdom born of critical reflection, which is a kind of meditation, and then wisdom born of concentrated meditation, bhavana, which Tibetans translate as gomba, which they translate as meditating, but the Sanskrit bhavana means to bring something into being, actually. And I'm now experimenting with translating bhavana, and therefore gom in Tibetan, as realization, actually. So there's wisdom born of realization, which is where shamatha, vipassana are interconnected.
Yeah.
And why? Because if you meditate a lot before you have some learning, especially about selflessness, about emptiness and selflessness, then you're likely to get into a state, because the mind is so powerful, where you will feel comfortable with your self-centeredness intact.
Yep.
And it'll be a kind of escapist state, a quietist type of escapist state. And then your growth as an overall person pursuing or evolving toward enlightenment will be stunted.
Yep.
Because you will find it tiresome to study. You will think you're enlightened because you're feeling calm and cool. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like getting addicted to a tranquilizer or something. And I think that's general Buddhist wisdom. And it goes against the grain of Dharma centers in the West because they're dealing with Western people who have been overeducated in negative forms of education, high conceptuality in a way. And who have found that made them feel more anxious and more uneasy and less comfortable in their lives. And when they do any kind of meditation where they sort of suspend their thinking process, they feel more comfortable. And then they tend to, and so that's a good sell. And then we can develop a big Dharma center or a cult.
Well, the yoga centers have done well off that as well.
They've done really well. The centers have done well, like creating cults out of people who are getting this tranking out thing. But actually, it has maybe not been helpful to all of them. Some of the people might have been so neurotic and anxious they would have run themselves off a cliff anyway. So they are probably helping them. But in a way, in a larger Buddhist context, it's not helpful. So the Rubicon that American Buddhists have to cross, I think, is the idea that although they learned a lot of stuff from Western knowledge systems, it was not the stuff that helped them become more complete beings. And Western spiritual systems also maybe didn't give them the learning and the meditative ability to experience the stuff that they're supposed to believe in. And so this is where Buddhism can offer great service to them if it's properly taught to them.
So what about mindfulness, like this being present and non-judgmental, and people are getting a lot of benefit of that? Is that similar to this sort of like...
Do you think there's it can be. Well, I'm not a purist in the sense that I don't put down John Kabat-Zinn or other people like that who have tried to move these techniques out of the religious Buddhist setting to offer them to Americans. And in fact, I started that myself. I gave a series of lectures that was going to be published by Parallax Press. I gave them at CIIS in San Francisco, called Buddhism Without Buddhism. They were titled, very popular in San Francisco. But then the different Buddhist groups who were going to publish them decided maybe they better not, because I was saying that what I meant by that is that Buddhism should be offered freely to people as a set of services. Psychological services, meditational services, medical services, philosophical services, scientific services, without demanding that the people using those services become religious Buddhists. And that they implement those services within their cultural context, whatever religion they were, So I was welcoming like Jew Boos and Chris Boos and other kinds of people like that. I must say I was less ecumenical about materialists, know. And His Holiness was encouraging to be more...
Don't they need it most?
What they maybe do, yes, they do.
Much?
The secular humanists. But I was very against nihilism. I thought it was very destructive. The idea of no future life, because I felt that's really key to the path. And His Holiness was trying to push me not to be so forceful about that. And maybe he was right in one way, and maybe in another way, the two different approaches are good for different kinds of teachers. Maybe. So I maybe like to still agree to disagree with him on that point and get after those materialists. At least I want to nowadays. So, but I can see being ecumenical. I mean, he's of course better than me, and he's naturally way better, and he's right in his own way. So, I'm not against that. But on the other hand, the non-judgmental, for example, might be good as a start for people just to become more aware of the content of their mind. Because people have a lot of negative stuff at lower, deeper levels in their mind, unordinary, uneducated about themselves people. And so to be non-judgmental at first, just to see that they might have some negative thoughts and let become aware of them is good. But then long term, if they just stay with that, then they get stunted at that
Yes.
level. And instead, there's a stage where they then should go in to start editing those thoughts,
Yes.
the way that Buddhist mindfulness teaches, and start critiquing and unconditioning or deconditioning the negative thought patterns and reinforcing the positive thought patterns, and actually reshaping their motivations and thoughts and things in a more sophisticated way. And eventually they should move on to that.
So there's probably a heap of people listening who are doing mindfulness practice,
Mm-hmm.
and if they just heard what you said, what would be the next step for them? What advice would you give them?
Learning.
Learning,
The
yeah.
next step for all the Buddhists, I think, is learning more. My next step all the time is learning more. And if anybody is setting a more important example for us, it's one of the great Buddhist masters of our era, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who's always learning more.
Yeah.
He's into learning things, even still. And he even disclaims, I'm this and that. I just did an interview with him where he said he was maybe 70, 80% toward being a bodhisattva, but he had a little further to go, 20 or 30%. He said.
Wow.
Of course, he was thinking of advanced bodhisattva,
Yeah.
naturally. People should know there's elementary bodhisattvas who might even be ignorant.
You met His
But
Holiness?
he's marvelous.
What age you met His Holiness? You mentioned what age you met His Holiness.
What's that?
What age did you meet His Holiness?
Oh, I was 23, he was 29.
29. So you've seen His Holiness
Yes.
from so. What was your
absolutely.
first impression?
51 years.
51 years. What was
Well,
your...
my first impressions of him were that he was extremely nice. I loved him immediately. But also I thought he was very uptight and nervous and stressed. He had a very high-pitched laugh that was really had to break through a kind of tenseness. I, of course, was comparing him with the Geshe Wangyal, who was
Geshe
60.
Wangyal, yeah.
60 at that time. He was 63. And he was way developed, He was like His Holiness is now, then. And with Ling Rinpoche also, who I immediately took a very, very respectful measure of. So in a way, I was more related to His Holiness at first like a fellow student or something, like,
Yes.
a colleague.
Yeah.
And a student, but I recognized that the deep reverence, of course, that and his sort of ex officio holiness.
Yeah.
But I didn't take it that seriously, I have to
Yeah.
say. And I was more wanting to be friendly with him. I think I irritated maybe some of his secretaries and courtiers by not groveling enough
Yes.
initially.
Yeah.
And even once suggested to him, why was he so stressed out about the politics? He could just be a Buddhist monk and forget about the whole thing.
Yes.
And he said to me, nothing I'd like better, but the Tibetans do depend on me, and I have like a duty for them. And I was like, because I was fanatically being a monk, trying to be a monk, you
Yeah.
see. And I was intolerant and unaware of the larger picture, silly,
So it's actually a little bit of a teaching in itself, because if you meet these great Geshes, they're like 60 years old,
Yes.
and they're so developed,
Yes.
it could be like, well, how could I possibly, reach anywhere near those heights? But then you meet someone like His Holiness and follow his journey from someone who's at that place and then becomes this great
Exactly.
world leader, great master. You think, oh, maybe there's hope for me yet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, that's the whole point of the Bodhisattva reincarnation, is they come
Yeah.
to be more near the regular people, so
Yeah.
that then they can inspire them. And that's why it's also nice to see Shakyamuni as being fully human, as Siddhartha. Even though he's incarnated purposefully and so forth, even in the Theravada tradition, actually they don't actually act like he's just like a regular, ordinary. Although Western versions of Theravada, I think they like to think that.
Yes. Yeah.
But the Theravada has a lot of gods and angels and incarnations and miracles, just like Mahayana. They shouldn't act like it's all invented by Mahayana.
Yeah. So do you consider Buddhist atheists or not?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
That's a completely wrong.
Yeah.
You could say, and I try to get His Holiness, I have been trying to get His Holiness to stop saying non-theistic,
Yeah.
which goes in India, and it's a habit in India to talk about Buddhists and Jains as non-theistic in relation to Shiva and Vishnu and company. But of course, Buddhists do believe in the existence of Shiva and Vishnu,
Yeah.
and Brahma and Indra and the whole passel of them.
Yeah.
And but they are non-monotheistic, or you could say non-creator theistic,
Yeah.
in that they don't blame any one God for creating everything and being in totally control of it. They consider that an irrational view. Maheshvara. And even the name Avalokita Ishvara, Ishvara itself means God.
Yeah.
And Avalokiteshvara the name itself is a critique of the creator monotheistic view. But they believe there are gods, for sure. All Buddhists, Theravada Buddhists do too.
Yes.
So you have to say, and they're not really polytheistic because we think of polytheistic as all the gods together create the universe.
Yes.
And the Buddhists don't think we humans and the insects and the gods all together create the universe. So we're not creator theistic.
Yeah.
If you say
Not creator theistic, yeah.
if you make a term like creator theistic,
Yeah.
then you could say non-creator theistic.
Yeah.
But other kinds of gods we definitely have.
And also, God is a type of birth, right?
Yes.
Whereas when like the Christian God, for example, was never born, for example,
Yes.
according
Oh,
to
yeah,
them.
that's a good theological
So there's a
point.
different point there.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's unborn,
He's
so
unborn.
therefore he must be Buddha.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
The unborn, the
The unborn
uncreated,
Buddha nature.
like Nirvana. Is like that,
Yeah. So then, I guess what I wanted to ask you about, you've seen not only Buddhism arrive
Yeah.
to the West, but also Buddhism develop. Like Buddhist, what was it like to be a Buddhist in the late '60s compared to 2016?
That's true.
And so, how has that changed, and how do you think that one can be, in getting specific, like a Mahayana practitioner in America in 2006, or even further, a Vajrayana practitioner? What does that mean in
Yes.
America today?
I'm not really in favor of the concept of Vajrayana Buddhism.
Yeah,
Of course, I consider Vajrayana to be the esoteric branch of Mahayana.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it's a separate thing. I know that some people do, and that there's a way of arguing that. And that's
What's the
their
argument
view.
for that? I'm not sure. Like
that?
I thought, Mahayana has two branches, like the
Yeah.
Bodhisattva,
Mainly.
Sutrayana and Vajrayana.
But that does turn a little bit on Tsongkhapa's idea,
Yeah,
where he connects the three yanas to polyandry.
yeah,
Same mother, three different fathers.
yes,
And the fathers are the different methods, or as I like to say, the three different arts. The art of everything existing, the art of everything non-existing or empty, the art of discerning between them. But so the same mother, meaning that the basic philosophy of all three is the same, which I would say would be Prasangika view.
Yeah.
And in that view, therefore, Vajrayana doesn't have a different philosophy or a different scientific reality base,
Yeah.
but it just has a more subtle and more sophisticated methodology.
yeah,
And under that line, then you should say Mahayana Buddhist who has reached a Vajrayana level of practice.
yeah,
You could say something like that, or that doesn't also exclude Theravada, Nikaya Buddhism, as you'd say. I do think Hinayana, which unfortunately is the only word you can use in the Tibetan language, Tegmen,
Yeah.
which I don't think, therefore, we should translate today in that way. I think Hinayana only referred to those members of monastic Buddhism who denied the philosophy of the Mahayana, which was not the majority until after the 10th century, when it was pretty much broken up in India anyway. And then Sri Lanka went back to kicking out its Mahayana monastery and its Vajrayana practitioners, which they had in Sri Lanka. And then they spread a version that was without that. But they were a minority, I think, in India, actually. Although they existed, we see evidence for them in Baba Viveka's chapter on the what he calls the Shravakas.
Yeah.
But Shravaka Tatvaijana chapter, But so many monasteries with Theravada or Mahasangika or Sarvastivada vows were built by Mahayanists.
Yeah.
You can't really say there was a difference. The Mahayana really was just a level of philosophy within the monastery and was totally pro-monasticism.
Yes.
So I like to call them monastic Buddhism, Messianic Buddhism, and apocalyptic Buddhism, as Western technical terms, but that hasn't caught on. It maybe catch on posthumously, possibly. But so far, nobody else. Or sometimes I call individual vehicle and universal vehicle about those two. And I like that term because it sort of deals with like the pratimoksha idea, so sort of sosotarva, individual. Just I myself, I'm getting liberated. Then I'm liberating everybody with me. And that goes individual, universal, fits nicely with that, I think.
But it's not possible to be a Vajrayana practitioner without being a universalist vehicle. Is that, or is there some argument for there is?
That's true. You should have because you should have bodhisattva vow.
Yes.
In a way, it doesn't make it's not reasonable to try to dangerously accelerate your evolution if you don't have a bodhisattva vow. There would be no rush to do that. Okay. You could just be an arhat and just be cool and take it easy, take a break.
Wait for the tap on the shoulder.
Yeah, that's right. Something like that. In another life, yes.
Okay. So then in terms of like in America in 2015...
Oh, yeah. So now there's an interesting dialectic, contradiction there. His Holiness sincerely and I think very rightly says, and I'm a convert to that position, that we should not be trying to engage in mass conversions and convert people to Buddhism. Mm-hmm. And this would then set a bad example for especially Christians and Muslims, who are the two big ones in doing that. The Jews very nicely don't bother. You have to be born Jewish practically or marry somebody. And this would lead to too much religious competition, and institutions competing for market share and so on, and which is something in the pluralistic setting of the modern society, global society, we should get over with. And I agree with that. We should see that by the Christian path, the Jewish path, the Muslim path, the Hindu path, the Taoist path, people can become enlightened in their own way, in their own cultural context. And we should not be fighting over, who's leading the way. But on the other hand, so therefore we shouldn't be pushing to create a lot of Buddhist centers and Dharma centers and things like that. On the other hand, societies are pluralistic, and some people will want to change, and they should be allowed to. It shouldn't be like punished for apostasy in any direction. Mm-hmm. And we have seen Buddhist centers grow, and that's fine too. But we shouldn't be pushing for that.
Yes.
And then he said at the very minimum, if people do decide to try to change, which he advises against, if they were brought up religiously, they should remain extremely respectful and ecumenical about the tradition they left and not negative toward it. So I think that's a great position. And I've been known to hold up my hand when he's delivering that prefatory thing to a large public lecture, where there was context and say, don't worry, Your Holiness, I didn't shift from Christianity. I was never a monotheist.
Yes.
Because I always argued against the priests and things when they said God created everything. I didn't think that was nice to God.
Yes.
To think that he would make a mess.
He made such a mess.
Exactly. So, and I used I didn't know Shunyata or Buddhist thought, so I used the concept of infinity. Oh. As to say, you can't say one person created infinite. It doesn't make sense.
Doesn't.
So I had so I said, you converted me from a kind of humanism.
Yep.
Or Buddhism did. I shifted to it out of the love of it, of her kind of humanism. I did say that to him. So but on the other hand, we do see Buddhist centers growing, and that's nice.
Yeah.
And but my main work, my life's work, has been to try to introduce the Buddhist sciences, what I consider the Buddhist sciences, arts and sciences, to the West. Because I think those can be used by Christians and Jews and secular humanists in a useful way. And I think Buddhist science on mind science level especially, but even physical science, even biological science, I'm getting older now and saying that, has a very useful contribution to make. Thomas Nagel wrote a great book called Mind and Cosmos recently, where he said materialistic reductionist biological sciences will not succeed in explaining life by that materialistic reductionism. Yep. And there must be, and they shouldn't think the only alternative is a naive theism. There should be a way of having mind as an active force in nature in a sort of specific and empirical way. And I was just chuckling to myself reading that, because it's saying he's calling for the theory of karma.
Yes.
Where the mind carries from life to life separately from the physical elements, and yet adopts the connection to new physical elements and shapes them, and therefore should be considered in a specific manner, not some sort of godlike, unchanging soul, but a changing genetic level of epigenetic, you might say, if you're taking gene as only material, epigenetic way of shaping your life. And that's a very valuable science, very valuable relativistic description that Buddha came up with long before Darwin.
So you think like Nagel's, what he's talking about now, the mechanism you could suggest karma to him.
Yes, and the way of doing that, I think, is, not as karma, but karmic, if biologists studied karma, and they began to try to think of mind as a kind of very subtle energy.
Yeah.
It's not I think it's fruitless, and it's simplistic for Buddhists to go around saying that materialist scientists have to accept the idea of mind as non-material.
Yeah.
There's some category mistake going on there.
Yeah.
And it's much better to say, think of mind as it's sort of quantum, subquantum, super subtle level of energy.
Energy. Yeah.
That is virtually, on a coarse level, non-material, but on a subtle level, matters.
Yeah.
So, overcome the whole idea of dualism, mind-matter dualism, by going to the subtle plane. And this is a contribution of Vajrayana science.
Yes.
Not Vajrayana sort of practice, but science.
Science.
Where in the super subtle level, Lu Sem Zechik, and Lung Sem Zechik.
Yeah.
Lu means lung,
Yeah.
and lung means subtle lung, not the coarse wind of the wind blowing the treetops.
And them being ngowa chik together,
Ngowa chik, Zechik even, they say. Same substance.
Same substance, yeah. So and then there's not a duality there. It's not like
it isn't like a radical dualism, conceptual dualism that is unbridgeable.
Because in Vajrayana, the metaphysics isn't dualistic.
No.
At the basic level.
Right.
Where maybe in Sutrayana you could talk about, if you look at Dharmakirti's proof of future lives, it seems like the metaphysics is a dualism.
There's an interactionism, mind-body interactionism there, which is good there when people are not at the subtle plane as the scientists are now with their quantum thing.
Yeah.
Wave particle. There was a great paper done by Indian scientists who I think are really great. And they have positions at Oxford and Caltech and stuff. It's not like they're just like they're minor league. They're major league global scientists.
Yeah.
But they respect Nagarjuna and Dharmakirti and people like that. They don't know that much about them, but they're ready to respect them.
Yeah.
And one of them did a thing like wave particle paradox connecting to mind-body.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
Now that's not that he solved it all, but that's the direction that I like to see happening.
So I had in the Buddhist Abhidharma text, like karma and these things are defined as shinto-kokya, deeply hidden.
Yeah.
So I wonder if they could be objects of the sciences as we know.
Well, because Shinto Kogyo is going on with microscopes and quantum and cloud chambers and what have you. They're dealing with Shinto Kogyo mechanically.
Yeah.
And conceptually, why are we not able to help them deal with it? That's again where Buddhist science can make a contribution, and those scientists can remain Jewish, Christian, humanist, whatever they like. The version of secularity that is so radically nihilistic about their own future destiny once they die, that they'll have to deal with. And most of them, when they die anyway, they call some rabbi to come, they hedge in their bets like Pascal did.
Pascal's
anyway,
wager.
when they physically have to die themselves.
Yeah.
And they should stop promoting to reckless psychotics that they can just kill themselves and then they don't have to pay for having just shot up a health center or a discotheque or something and killed a bunch of people.
Yeah, that there is the consequence.
So there's an irresponsible version of secularism, in other words, as well as an irresponsible version of Islam or Christianity, of a fanatic, killing in God's name or Jesus' name or Muhammad's name. Those are the irresponsible versions of all of them. And Buddhist science and philosophy and psychology can help people deal with those things without having to change them out of being quote unquote secular or scientific or whatever. That would be my sort of level where I really I think Buddhism has a lot to offer.
Very nice. And it's the people like I always wonder, why is the Dalai Lama talking to the scientists at Mind and Life? Why isn't he talking to people like Thomas Nagel and those guys? Do you think that could...
Well, he's been monopolized by Mind and Life, which has been dominated by, people who are themselves dominated by the corporate university system in America, which is invested in this nihilistic view.
Yeah.
And, psychology is controlled by people who want to sell drugs or create electrical things that can influence your brain, stimulate your brain. a little more heinously. And drugs and neurotransmitter controlling drugs.
Yeah.
And so the university has to uphold that view, and the doctors have to uphold that view because of the huge business interests that want to dominate your state of mind with these physical substances.
Karma's bad for business. You can't package up good karma.
Yeah, and the universities are corrupted by them, and they are the high priests of the current day, the natural scientists. And they work for, like the chairwoman. Years ago when I was chairing religion department at Columbia, the chairwoman of psych department came in one day in a bad mood, very mad about something, and was she Darcy something, I forgot her last name, very lovely person, and she came in and said, I hate my department, I hate this, I'm mad, and something. And I said, well, what's the matter? She said, we don't do research anymore, we just work for Novartis, was what she said. True. That's Columbia University, great research university, psych department. They don't teach Freud. They don't teach Jung. You have to go to the social studies program at Teachers College or at the School of Social Work to read Freud and Jung and whatever psychologists. They just do materialistic experiments, animal experiments in psych departments for those big neurotransmitter, psychotropic drug manufacturer pushers, which are making a fortune with all their tranquilizers. And it's a disgrace,
Yeah, so the money and
so the point is that a lot of but His Holiness, never mind, he reaches into there, he's humble, he listens to them, he learns about them, and all along they've all kept me under control because they don't want me. They think I'm going to scare away all these scientists if I really engage with them.
Yeah,
and like I remember an incident at one of those conferences where I managed to go and I managed to say something, and I said, you guys should stop worrying about the non-material to material causal influence problem.
Yep.
It's a subtle to coarse influence problem, causal influence problem.
Yep.
And that was like a sort of tea time statement, and then nobody discussed it.
Yeah.
It's like, and I have to say, it's like there was a session I went to on addiction, and His Holiness himself said at that session, well, what about, I've heard that LSD, he said, and the psychedelic drugs have been helpful with alcoholics, because they were talking a lot about alcoholism. Yeah. And he was completely shushed down by someone from the NIH and NIMH, U.S. government, and all the kind of neuroscience guys working for all those grants.
Yeah.
He was shushed down. Oh, no, we don't talk about that.
Yeah. Because,
Meanwhile, that's the one thing that has been successful curing alcoholics.
Yeah.
Besides AAA, religious one, is the Stan Groff, at the Spring Grove. I don't know what you know about it, but for years, even after it was illegal, Schedule I drug, he healed thousands of people from alcoholism with low doses of LSD.
Yeah. And so what you're bringing this up for is because this is an example of the subtle or
subtle stuff.
Yeah, the subtle stuff influencing, gross stuff influencing subtle stuff and vice versa.
And I'm bringing it up because it also is a subject matter now in our culture of the vision quest thing. I just read an article today in Mother Jones about people who are trying to research ecstasy.
Yeah.
Because they have helped thousands of PTSD veterans overcome PTSD in a few weeks using this in a psychological setting. Yeah. And yet it's illegal Schedule I drug, and they're ready to be shot by the DEA.
Yeah. So what do you think of like psilocybin and
they're all very useful.
So in terms of non-dual experiences and stuff like that?
They are very useful. They should be part of... Buddhist science should encourage Western science, psychology in particular, to use them in controlled settings the way they were used before they were popularized by Leary and Company as a therapeutic excellent things, which are really very helpful and much more better than this kind of Prozac, Zoloft stuff. And because they're stimulating natural things that you naturally, your own adrenal glands produce if you go fast for 6 months. Or 40 days in the wilderness, you'll have experiences so like that. So they are ancient, a lot of them are herbal, and they're ancient things that tribal societies use, indigenous people very effectively. And it's part of our industrial madness. So we think we lump them in with things like heroin and cocaine that are absolutely not psychedelic.
So you were around with Leary at Harvard
at that time? Yeah, I knew those people, but I disagreed with them on their materialism. Yeah. I was happy with Ram Dass when he moved into Hindu spirituality, Richard Alpert. But I knew them when they were Richard Alpert and Tim Leary and at Harvard, sure.
Wow. And so they weren't on were they on the wrong track or the right track?
No. Well, they discovered these things
Yeah.
from tribal people in Mexico and other places initially. And then Albert Hoffman, discovered things in Switzerland, in the chemical level, working for Sandoz.
Yeah.
And then this was a very creative movement within psychology. And conventional psychologists were doing a lot of good work with autistic people and all kinds of things. And then they were doing interesting work at Harvard and MIT. And then they fell out for personal reasons, with the establishment. Yeah. And then they started a kind of a cult themselves, cult movement, and then it became illegal. And then all the psych people were all shut down for 30, 40 years, while we had great leadership in the form of Nixon and Reagan and company ruining the whole world, So it was too bad they took it out of context themselves, in a naive socio-political way. Yeah. But in another way, of course, it shaped the world in a powerful way. And some people were damaged, but a lot of people opened their eyes. And the ones who did well, again, it's like the meditation thing. They had these like sort of special experiences, but then they went and learned how that worked.
Yes.
They learned something. They didn't just constantly get stoned.
Yeah.
So it's the same as doing some sort of quietistic meditation. You realize that your mind is an amazingly powerful thing against the dictates of our materialist culture, and then you learn how to use it.
Yeah, so then you learn something about your mind as well.
That's it.
And then you learn something about the world.
Yes, that's where Buddhist science can help.
Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about is I went to a couple of years ago, I think it was, His Holiness's teachings in Boston.
Yes.
And as I was lined up, there was this whole ruckus and noise across the street, and there were protesters. And they had one particular sign, quite a large one, and it was a cartoon of yourself as a puppet. And it said, His Holiness's, Professor Thurman or Robert Thurman, His Holiness is the Dalai Lama's puppet.
Yeah, and he was peeking over the top of the sign.
Top of it.
And he had an expression on his face. They made him look like a rodent or something, and he was holding the strings of my puppet.
Exactly. I thought...
I was honored. I was
quite a compliment.
Yeah. I was deeply honored by it.
So what was?
And this is this group that headed by a person named Kelton Gaucho, who pretends to a Geshe degree, a spiritual friend degree, Kalyana Mitra, which he didn't really earn according to current research. And who's sort of mentally stuck himself in a cult-like thing coming from the Pamukkar Rinpoche, who otherwise was a very great teacher in the past generation in Tibet, and which is a kind of minority movement within the Gelugpa school of several hundred years' duration that pretty much has been a minor influence, but it's the sort of most super orthodox members of that tradition. Since the time of the fifth Dalai Lama, when the Dalai Lama was ruler of Tibet, they wanted him to use his political authority to force all Tibetans to be Gelugpa Buddhists. And all the Dalai Lamas successively have refused to do that and kept pushing this cult down. And during the interregnums, when the young Dalai Lamas are trying to grow up, this cult tends to pop up. Has since the 1650s, and then each Dalai Lama, when they come to their majority, those who did come to their majority, they push it back down. And so the present Dalai Lama has done the same thing, because he represents all the Tibetan Buddhists and even the Bömbos and even Tibetan Christians and Tibetan Muslims, or if there were Tibetan secularists, humanists, he would represent them. And he doesn't want to be push a particular order, although all the Dalai Lamas have been very fond of the philosophical and scientific teachings of Tsongkhapa as one of the great Tibetan Lamas. But as had most of the other Lamas of other schools have also been that way. So, and the big universities in a way, the Harvard and Cambridges of the Oxford, Harvard, Cambridge, Yale, etc. of Tibet have been the big Gelugpa monasteries for the most part until the 19th century. And so this has popped up again, and this Kelton Gaucho guy pushes that. And then he's founded a big cult out of England that pushes it, and he has a lot of people. He signed up around Europe especially, but all over the world really, pushing this idea. Yeah. And then in about 15 years ago, approximately, maybe 20 years ago, the Chinese United Front Work Department got wind of a potential dissident group within the majority school of Tibetan Buddhism, in Tibet primarily, of course, as well as in exile and as well as in Mongolia and so on. And so they decided, hey, let's hook up with this Kelton Gaucho guy. He has a big cult of Westerners who don't know what's going on, or cult members, and let's use it to try to alienate Tibetan Buddhists from the Dalai Lama in Tibet and in Mongolia and in exile in India among the Tibetan community and create dissension among that community. And let's use it to diminish his reputation in exile. I mean, in amongst Westerners, and in Japan, if necessary, wherever we can. And so they started funding, not necessarily Kelton Gaucho, who already had a big cult and he'd been getting people to give them all their money for quite a while. So he has like a Mooney type of cult, with a lot of property. But he probably didn't need funding. But some of the Tibetan exiles in India, they got big funding. The Tibetan dissident movement in Delhi, they got big funding. The ones in Tibet definitely have had big monasteries built for them, big statues, and then they're starting that in Mongolia. They did in Mongolia as well. In Amarbal Skalant Monastery, they built a huge shukden, statues out gilded, out of solid gold practically, and so on. And they slipped them in everywhere they could all over Mongolia. So this movement is like that, and they've flown around. They just follow their guru's thing. A lot of them are dressed as monks, but are not really monks. He's became so cult-like, Kelton Gaucho, that he has a special ordination he gives himself. When we did research about it, which is not a regular responsible Buddhist monastic ordination at all, and he allows them to wear those robes even though they don't really have permission to do so from world Buddhism, and they don't have a proper Mula Sarvastivada vow, which is what Tibetan Buddhist monks have, a Theravada vow, and they only read his books, his translations of Tibetan books. The juice in his cult comes from the great teachings of Tsongkhapa, which he has some translations of, which were the root thing, but then he kind of corrupts it and simplifies it. And the sad thing is he teaches a protector cult, which is just like a kind of minor side trip in Tibetan Buddhism to, your protectors, they sort of take care of the weather and they help you out with your finances and whatever, protect against earthquakes, but which is considered a minor thing by Buddhists. And now he's making it into a Buddha. He's become so isolated and kind of crazy himself, the leader has. And so they protest against the Dalai Lama to try to besmirch his reputation. It isn't really a protest. Amnesty International researched it, and other groups researched it to see if it was that the Dalai Lama was infringing on the religious rights of these people. And they dismissed the allegation, and the Indian courts dismissed the allegation because the Dalai Lama was only asserting his religious right, which is those who follow that protector against his advice, he does not allow them to take initiations from him, because in an initiation you say to the teacher in the initiation, now I will follow your advice. Or I will dissociate myself from this practice. And which you're allowed to do too. But that's his religious freedom, that he doesn't want to teach people who are actually saying he's no good. Because they couldn't be doing it for the right motive, So that I am, since I've done research and the Tibet houses as a defense of Tibetan culture. Because the reason we do it as a defense of Tibetan culture is that these people make newcomers think that all Tibetan Buddhist culture is about some sort of demon worship. And some kind of weird, sorcerous manipulations of angels, of fierce angels, seraphim and cherubim sort of thing. And that is a besmirching of Tibetan culture. So on that light, we did research into the cult, into the history of the Shukden or Dolgel entity, and we follow the Dalai Lama's view that it is a negative thing, although I have a slightly disagreeing opinion myself personally.
About what?
Well, about which I like people to know just so they'll think a little deeper. Well, both His Holiness and the pro-Shukden people consider that this is the reincarnation of a Lama who would kind of turn to the dark side in the 1650s and 1640s, when the Dalai Lama institution began to have political responsibility in Tibet.
Around the fifth Dalai Lama, right?
Yeah, around the time of the fifth Dalai Lama. And what I think is that from Tsongkhapa's time, Khedrup and his people who did some exorcisms of various negative spirits in Tibet during a time around 1615, 4 years before Tsongkhapa died.
Yeah.
They did a lot of sort of this kind of ritual because he was about to die in 1615. And they thought maybe he was being afflicted by some negative thing, because Tibetans have that idea of spirit. Tibetan science has the idea there are negative entities, you know. And they then pacified them all, and Tsongkhapa's health recovered. And he lived 4 more years. And he did some other good things during those years.
Tsongkhapa?
Yeah, Tsongkhapa. But there was one that they said, there's one entity from south central Tibet, but I haven't found a name for it. Yeah. They didn't give a region or a name. There's one entity that's really powerful, and we couldn't completely subdue and have him sort of sign up to not bother people. And so what he said to us was, okay, I'll lay off Tsongkhapa and his followers for 13 generations. Yeah. And after that, you have to make a special chapel to me and perform some prayers and rituals to me and offerings.
So this is the 1400s, right?
Yes, 1415.
1450.
So I'll lay off for 13 generations.
Yeah.
And then I'll be nice. And after that, you'll have to re-propitiate me.
Yep.
And he mentioned this to Tsongkhapa. Khedrup did. Khedrup Gelek Pelsambo, one of his top disciples. And Tsongkhapa said, forget that turkey. I'm not going to, later that my followers will do what they do. I'm not going to make deals with these negative entities.
Yes.
So forget about it. I'm glad I'm not being bothered now, and I'm still working here for a while. But we don't make promises like that.
Yeah.
So there's a story like that. If you take 13 generations and you come up with about 250 years,
1600s.
You get up to the mid-1600s.
Yeah. Dalai Lama time.
And so I think that entity came in, impersonated, he might have even afflicted to the dark side that Lama, who was considered one of the two main tulkus of Drebung, like the Dalai Lama was. Although later Dalai Lama got aggravated and said, he's probably not the right reincarnation, and maybe he was right. Or maybe even to start with, there was something a little bit wrong with him. But in any case, impersonated that person and started from within the Gelugpa order, started messing up the Gelugpa order with this cult of making super intolerant Gelugpas who were against ecumenism. And luckily the Dalai Lamas have kept that under control, like Tsongkhapa predicted they would, but it's something more negative, in other words, than another Lama who was once good and turned to the dark side. I have that theory.
So you just saw, you read this in one of
Tsongkhapa's biographies.
By Khedrup J?
No, it wasn't mentioned in that. It was one of the Namtar Chemos. But I haven't been able to find it again. And I've asked some donor, lots of people, can you tell me about this? And they go like, and nobody has given me this particular story with more detail. So I haven't had time to research it. I hope somebody will do it as a PhD. Yes. I have a student doing PhD on Tsongkhapa's biography. Maybe he will find out about it. I hope so.
That's very interesting.
I think it's a lot of fun because even the followers or I think that the element of selling the Shugden thing by Pabonkan Company has to do with that they think that originally there was a good guy who turned to the dark side. It's like Darth Vader. He had a good side earlier on. You see. Yeah. Whereas I think that may be so, but this is some other entity that
always was
dark side.
Malevolent.
Period.
Yeah, malevolent. And then, why do you think that sect has been so successful in getting converts in the West? It would seem quite a strange sell to sell this a protector or whatever in the West. Why?
Well, they don't do that right away. Yeah. They use some of the nice things of Tsongkhapa, and in a way, they use the charisma of the Tibetan Buddhist lamas, who are great, like Dalai Lama, Karmapa Company, the great Nyingma lamas like Khyentse Rinpoche. They use that. That's how they've been successful. I mean, Tibetan Buddhism as a whole has been worldwide successful because of bringing the Buddhist sciences out, which are the ancient Indian Nalanda sciences, as His Holiness says, bringing them out to serve people, and even not very too much pushing them for denominational sign-up. Yeah. So these are abusing these guys, and they are making cults for themselves. Yeah. Just like why was Muni cult so successful for quite a while? Yeah. Because cults depend upon a central figure, And then he has lieutenants who then have a stake to maintain his legend, and then they use his charisma indirectly. And then they build people who are lost in it. And listen, we're in a turbulent time, and look at ISIS. Why is ISIS so successful?
Exactly.
Muhammad would be embarrassed by suicide bombers.
Yeah.
Muhammad was not using suicide bombers.
Yeah.
He's against suicide. The Quran is against suicide.
Yeah.
And especially they're against terrorism, which is unmanly for the ancient Arab warrior codes, which was the culture Muhammad gave his revelation in. And in those codes, you fight your enemy, you don't go kill his wife and kids.
Yes.
Or some other weird people in a laundromat who are washing his burnous.
Yeah.
You don't kill them, you kill him, fight him, man to man.
Yeah.
You know? And so they, people corrupt these things, and then they use them, and then they prey on people's insecurities and their childish authoritarian personality structure.
It seems like the tradition and the wisdom has been lost. For example, the wisdom of what to look for in a teacher.
Yeah, that's right. And yes, in Buddhism in particular, by the way, with the concept of Kalyana Mitra.
Yeah.
And, well, first of all, in the Theravada Vinaya and the Mahasangika Vinaya, the Nikaya Buddhist Vinaya, the teacher, the upadhyaya and so forth, and the abbot of the monasteries, these people were not authorities particularly, and in Buddhist monastic virtues, obedience is not a big one.
Yeah.
In fact, it's not hardly mentioned. Obedience is the primary Buddhist, Christian monastic virtue in all of the rules of Benedict and rules of St. Basil and so on, but not in Buddhist monasteries. So in the Sangha, the Buddha was imitating the Republican Buddhist city-states where there was a serious council of elders, which was called Sangha, that advised kings. And a king was really very much primus inter pares, as they say, first among equals, in regard to making decisions. The king was not like a super autocrat in those Republican things, which is why people have said, scholars have said, that the Buddhist Sangha had a natural democratic structure to decision-making in Buddhist Sangha already, which is against the Indian patriarchal guru thing and against the kingship model in the Mahabharata and of Indian kingship, Vedic kingship ideas. Yeah. And then in the Mahayana, the teacher mode is the Kalyana Mitra, and Mitra means a friend, rather than an authority figure. Yes. And Kalyana means virtue, so a virtue friend who inspires you to do virtuous things like a friend, but not an authority sitting on, not like guru, which in Sanskrit means heavy. The root meaning of guru in Sanskrit just means some heavy weight on top of your head, related to the patriarchal family structure of Indian society, where the father's the big authority in the family. Yeah. So Buddhism was undoing that authority thing, like Buddha rebelled against his father and went out to become enlightened. Yeah. So now Guru comes back in Tantrayana in an initiatory setting, but the Tibetans actually are limiting its role by translating guru not as some derivative, etymological derivative of the word heavy, but by lama, which means not something higher than you necessarily, just something you don't get past. Yeah. Like unexcelled. Yeah. It's like, as I always like to say, it's the lama figure in Tibet is a tar baby figure rather than a high authority sitting on top of your head. Yeah. Do you know what I mean by tar baby?
No.
Well, Tar Baby is from the cartoon Pogo, where it's in some American thing, where when you try to get rid of this thing and you grab it and then you get stuck to it. You can't get rid of it.
It never leaves you. It's for good.
Yeah, it's you're stuck on it, right? But it's not higher than you, it's that you're stuck in it. Yeah. Just that's why I really don't like translating Lame Gyu as highest yoga tantra. That's a mistranslation. It's unexcelled yoga tantra. Means you don't get past it. It isn't higher up than everything. It's the heart of everything rather than above it. So I really dislike, even though some Tibetan lamas will gloss Anuttara as Parama. Yeah. It's not Parama, that's the point. Yeah. They could say Parama Yoga Tantra. They don't. They say Anuttara.
Did they say Anuttara in Sanskrit? Or was it
They do.
Okay.
They say Anuttara. But and then they took that Anuttara and made Guru out in Anuttara. Yeah. Rather than something Jiva. Yeah. Fat fat and heavy.
Yeah.
So anyway, so in other words, the authoritarian, and why is the authoritarian thing not the case in Buddhism in general? Is because the person has to realize enlightenment, they have to attain wisdom themselves.
Yeah.
The teacher is a real educator of them, educare, leading out of them their own wisdom, giving them reasons, debating them, critiquing them, inspiring them to think deeper thoughts. But it's their thoughts opening up and their insight that makes them liberated. The teacher cannot liberate them. So their just by brainwashing them, they will not be liberated. And therefore, the Buddhist model of the teacher is anti-authoritarian, actually. And therefore, this notion, which unfortunately some Tibetan Lamas have exploited, where once I initiate you, then you can't say boo to me.
Yeah.
And be my chauffeur, be my cook, be my French maid, drive my limo.
Yeah.
And don't ask twice if I look like I'm saying jerky things or behaving badly or embezzling money or grabbing people's snatch. Yeah. Don't criticize me because I initiated you. Yeah. So I'm Buddha.
Yeah.
That's wrong. You know, a statue or a painting is Buddha for the practitioner who is imagining the presence of Buddha through the painting or the statue. Yeah. So in a ritual setting, the Lama conferring the initiation should be visualized as indivisible from Buddha. But the Lama himself is like a clay statue. So then when the Lama's outside farting around, you don't have to go around like they're Buddha. And that's why they have, someone like Dalai Lama has what I call resilience and flexibility of identity. And therefore he chats with you in a normal manner walking around. It doesn't act like he's on a high teaching throne at all times. Yeah. And that is really important, I think. Yeah. That's how we can avoid, because unfortunately in American Buddhism and Hinduism, and probably Taoism, but it's a much smaller movement, there are already people who were turned off to the whole movement by cult-like behavior of lamas and roshis, for that matter, with total scandals all over Zen centers. Yeah. And this has to do with Americans who have their own patriarchal, monotheistic, authoritarian personality structure, and then they transfer that onto a cult figure. Yeah. And unfortunately, the Asian teachers lend themselves to that because they get power and money out of it, and pleasure out of it. Some of them, and it ends up being very harmful to the student and eventually harmful to the teacher. They might still have some good qualities, and then they get all megalomaniac out of people worshiping them.
So maybe here's a little clue for people like checking out a teacher. How does the teacher act once they step down from the throne?
That's one quote.
If they still expect you to treat them like the Buddha, then check a little harder, maybe.
That's right. And, it's like you can treat them like a Buddha when you're in a meditation seat. Yeah. But when you're walking down the street with them, if they tell you, Dalai Lama was very funny about this once. He said, I have to be very careful what I say. Yes. He said, like Tilopa told Naropa, go grab these jewels and go jump off the roof and all this. Yeah. And then Tilopa would come and every bone in his body would be broken. Tilopa would come and just wave his head and be healed. Yeah. He said, not only can I not do that, some hippie couple might jump off one of these terraces here in Dharamsala. He said, if I hinted like really person would jump off. I said, in that case, not only do I not have the power to heal them with a wave of my hand, but we don't even have ambulance service here in Dharamsala.
Yeah, and the burden is really on the student to see in a certain way and imagination.
Finally, wisdom wisdom means critical discernment and discrimination and knowledge of what is correct, realistic, and unrealistic, and that's what the student has to develop. Yeah. So the teacher thing and students are, but they shouldn't. And the other thing is, if they have a teacher who goes off the rails, but they did learn something earlier, they should not hate and condemn that teacher. They can say to that teacher and to the public, and Dalai Lama says they should go to the press and say, this guy went off the rails and they're doing stuff that is not proper. Yep. And I dissociate myself and can't follow anymore. However, I did learn some good things, and I appreciate what they did teach me in the previous, and I hope he gets back on the rails. Yep. And then in their meditation, don't hate that person, because then they poison themselves from what they learned previously. Yep. So oppose, critique publicly if necessary, but don't hate and don't completely go against everything that you ever learned, if you ever did learn anything worthwhile.
And
that's a very key.
That's
middle way, moderation, being
nice.
practical.
And then the difference between... Can we just draw a distinction in the West, like a difference between teacher and Lama? Or it feels like to me this word Lama is getting very confusing in the West. And like someone does a 3-year retreat, they become Lama. Someone does, some other course, they become a Lama, or they give themselves this word Lama.
Yeah.
And if it would be, if we translated it to guru, then it would be very, very strange to my ears.
Yeah.
Someone does a 3-year retreat and they say, now I'm Guru Daniel.
Yeah.
It's like ridiculous. But it seems like the word Lama is...
Well, I wouldn't blame the word. I mean, and actually I like the word Lama.
Yeah.
But it's like mama, mama, papa, mama, lama. It's kind of fun.
Yeah.
But I agree that it is misused, and the Tibetans have to take responsibility for that.
Yeah.
For example, a 3-year retreatant who already was a Tibetan monk, mostly, some lay people, but mostly monks, then go off and do a 3-year retreat. Then they can come back, and they are accepted respectfully as teachers in monasteries that they came from. Even if they have become a layperson, if they have real attainment, they will be respected, and they have a livelihood and a social status as a Lama.
Yeah.
But a Westerner who's barely learned the language in 3 years, and who has done some things, though, and maybe had some insights and some experiences, but still, they cannot teach in a Tibetan monastery. They will not be accepted because they're whiteys. They're Ingis.
Yeah.
And a few of them can be writers and create like following, but mostly they have no livelihood and they don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And the Tibetan Lamas should not produce them like that. Years ago, to Nyosho Khenrinpoche, the late Nyosho Khenrinpoche, I suggested, and to another younger Lama who's still alive, so I won't mention the name, I suggested in Asia, just in a casual conversation, that when someone applied to them for a 3-year retreat, a Westerner, if they really thought they were really genuine material and really sincere, they should send them to a place like Naropa, CIIS in California, or some future academic program that we could create somewhere.
Yes.
Sarnath, CUTS, if they were living expatriate, and get MAs and learn the language. And then continue their practices and, take teachings and so forth, and build up for their 3-year retreat. Then take the 3-year retreat and considered in a Western sense, field work. Then write a dissertation or whatever it might take to become a counselor like Ken MacLeod is, the guy in California. And then they get to, if Tibetans like to call them Lama so-and-so, that's up to them. And if they want to use that or not, that's up to them.
Started with Kalu.
That's their certificate. But they will have a PhD or a Psi PhD or a counseling ed degree or whatever it is. And they have a role in Western society, which is the one they live in.
Yes.
And they have a livelihood and they can use their Dharma to benefit other people.
Yes.
And Nyosho Khenrinpoche said, that is really what we should be doing, and talk to the other people. So there was the other Lamas, the younger ones there. And then he passed away. They didn't move a muscle toward doing that. Not one muscle. And people are on their own, kind of, And I don't think it's fair. And I think eventually Tibetans will take that responsibility, and they should do so. I personally think. Understanding reality makes one happy. That's my main slogan.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you.
Have written down. That's because reality is happiness. That's why. This is the contradictory statement, our Mahayana Buddhist contradictory statement to the Western statement that ignorance is bliss. And you don't want to know too much about reality because it's too freaky. And of course, if you look at the news, it looks like that. And Buddha even hid it in the sense that when he said, Nirvana is reality, which he said from the beginning, he didn't characterize it as happiness. He just said cessation of suffering. He let people work on that, chew on that. Later on, in the Lotus Sutra, not just in Tantra, but in Lotus Sutra, he said, it's all my body. The whole universe is the golden body of me. Then I just mentioned about suffering to get some people to work on it. But it's not suffering. The reality of it is bliss. And then, of course, Vajrayana works with that. Clear light of bliss and the clear light of reality. And that's why understanding reality, that therefore realism is bliss, ignorance is suffering. It's the opposite slogan. That's our slogan. And that's what Buddha discovered. And I haven't discovered it. I'm still freaking out over Donald Trump, who I actually am fond of, but He's being really stupid and nasty, and I certainly wouldn't want him as a president. But I like it. He's challenging the other hypocritical, money-chasing puppet politicians. That part I like. Mm-hmm. I don't like him bitching at women and whatever. But I do like that he's talking about those others as a bunch of because we're in this all like plutocracy, That's why people do like him, I think, and forgive his other more nasty statements. But anyway, reality is bliss. So that my slogan, what Buddhism is actually, is realism. Mm-hmm. When someone asks me in one word or one phrase, what is Buddhism? I say Buddhism is engaged realism. Mm-hmm. That's what it is. Period. It's not, and Buddha, Max Weber could not fit Buddha in as a prophet and religion founder.
Yeah, because.
So then he had to make it. He called the emissary and exemplary prophet. Mm-hmm. So the emissary are the ones who meet God, and then God sends them out. Mm-hmm. And the exemplary one is the one who just lives by a certain example, but which means really not a prophet,
The emissary of reality.
Something like that. Yeah, or example of reality. That's right. Yeah. So anyway, that's what I have to say. Okay?
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Really nice to have you on the Wisdom Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Professor Thurman. Next week, I'm joined by Professors C.W. Huntington from Hartwick College and Francesca Cho from Georgetown University. We will be discussing Sandy Huntington's latest book, Maya, a Novel, and talking about Buddhist fiction and how it relates to Buddhist philosophy.
Among the bas-relief carvings on the outer gate of the stupa at Amaravati, one of the most ancient of all Buddhist archaeological sites, there is a depiction of the Bodhi tree, its branches sheltering an unoccupied throne. This is where the Buddha should be sitting, but the artist has rendered only a tree surrounded by a group of figures, the demons of Mara attacking an empty throne. This is a throne of memory and imagination, of desire and fear. This is the throne of the exalted ego, and, as the Buddha saw, and we are clearly meant to see, its occupant is missing. No Buddha, no self.